Hello guys, it's me, the guy Samito called stupid for saying that they would sabotage the 6v6 playtest and then it turned out to be true and then he didn't retract his statement. Today, I want to talk about something I saw on the forums, which were people discussing triple support and quad support in the 6v6 rank mode and talking about its viability or if it's actually really overpowered or really terrible or whatever it may be. Anyway, the general post, I'm paraphrasing, said something along the lines of, why are you allowed to play quad support and not quad tank if quad support is stronger because support is a stronger role than tank, or it's the best role in the game or something like that, right? And I completely agree, and so does everyone that actually understands this game, because support has been kind of the main reason for a lot of this game's issues for a very long time, dating back to essentially Ana, because Ana was the first extremely oppressive support we got in the game, because on release, her nade was really good, and it gave us quad tank, which was absolutely vile to play against, but it is what it is. Anyway, let's continue on. Is triple support or quad support genuinely a viable comp in the 6v6 mode? And it is, but it depends on the supports you're running. Now, if you were going to be running some... Oh, by the way, cool Genji tech there. Did you see me, like, launch into the sky? That was cool. Anyway. Look at that! Anyway, so, let's say you're running quad support, but you're running something like, I don't know, Moira, Mercy, Lucio, fucking Lifeweaver, right? Like, you're not cooking up a storm there, are you? Back to support comps. So generally speaking, the way you make a triple support or a quad support comp actually work is that you have to get the understanding that it's not necessarily the healing that makes it so viable. It's one of the main parts that makes it so successful, because having so much healing and so many healing options is obviously important. But the general reason you're going to run it are things like utility, invulnerability, denial, and so on, which is what we see when the majority of triple support comps. Now, sometimes people are running really damage-based ones with Mercy, Zen, Kiri, and then if they have another support, it might be something like a Moira for the super sustain, or a Baptiste for the damage and the sustain, and so on. But generally speaking, when people are running triple support comps, they are running denial comps, which usually involves Kiriko, Bap, Lifeweaver, Brig, things like that, or other variations of that. You can trade the Brig out for something else, but the point is you're getting tons of healing, tons of denial, utility, and survivability, while also having a lot of supports that are capable of dueling out DPS. Now, the only reason you wouldn't pick a DPS, the only reason you would pick a DPS in a comp when a comp like that's available would be something like that's able to provide burst damage. So something like a Widow that can actually just kill someone, or a Sojourn that can burst someone down, because DPS are really good conduits for support utility. It's better to have support utility on another DPS than it is to have them on another support, because DPS are simply better at utilizing those resources and turning them into value, which means, typically speaking, you would run a triple support comp with something like a Sojourn, because Sojourn is such an amazing conduit for support utility, and the fact that she's able to just burst targets down, especially against if they're mirroring a triple support comp, you're actually able to kill through a lot of their denial in a lot of cases. So typically speaking, that's what you would run, but obviously there are other options as well for different compositions you might want to play. Now, on to what I believe to be the best quad support comp, or even triple support comp, if you want to swap one of them out. Obviously, you can change them around if you want, but I think it would be something along the lines of Zenyatta, Kiriko, Baptiste, and Ana. Mainly because that's a fucking ridiculous amount of damage output. You also have AoE sustain, tons of healing. Also, you have speed boost on ultimate with the Kitsune. You have MO, and so on. You have basically everything you could ever need from a quad support comp. I mean, there's nothing you're really missing out on other than like damage boost, but unless you're going to be running a Sojourn in a quad support comp, which you likely aren't, but if you are running a quad support comp, you're likely not going to be running a DPS, you're likely going to be running 2 tanks, but on the off case you are running a DPS in your quad support comp, Might want to consider swapping one of them out for Mercy, so that you have the damage boost onto your DPS to keep them up for a little bit longer and keep them in the fight a little bit longer, and then the rest of the resources usually go to the tank. Some cases that's different, like the game you're watching in the background, where I essentially had 4 supports pocketing me all game, which was absolutely hilarious and a dream, and this was the most fun game of Overwatch I've ever played in my entire life. Anyway, now let's talk about some of the reasons you probably shouldn't run a triple support comp or a quad support comp. Generally speaking, these comps are going to be a little bit harder to play. Wow, that dash was absolutely fucked. This game's terrible. Anyway, these comps are going to be a little bit harder to play because they're going to feel a little bit less consistent than something like a 2-2-2 comp. When you're running something like a 2-2-2 comp, you know for a fact you're going to have the front line or whatever, the tank trade going on. You're going to have DPS contesting angles, and you're going to have supports obviously supporting those angles and the front line and so on, or whatever it may be, right? That's a relatively consistent, structured composition that's going to flow the same way every time you run it, generally speaking. So when you're running a quad support comp or a triple support comp, you're obviously not going to have that same structure, which will make it feel different to play, which is actually important in understanding when things happen and when things don't happen. Because of the fact that it's a different composition, it'll be harder to grasp when things should happen. Another reason is a lot of the angles become much harder to duel out, and although the supports are absolutely fantastic duelists, they're not able to maintain themselves within that fight for much longer. They don't have a lot of offensive utility that actually helps them in a duel. They typically have a lot of utility that supports someone else in a duel. Now, obviously, Kiriko is a fantastic duelist by herself, but generally speaking, a Kiriko is going to be more useful on an angle when she's fighting with a DPS, because all of her abilities actually help a DPS more so than it helps herself. So obviously when you're going to be fighting for those angles as supports now, you're going to have to be playing those angles a lot differently, because you don't have that DPS typically that's going to help actually fight through that angle with you. You're going to have to find a way to do it on support, and that's going to be a bit more difficult for supports to do. So that is a reason you might not want to do it if you're on a map where certain angles are very, very important, like New Queen Street, or you're on Havana, or you're on Circuit Royale, maps like that, where the DPS are going to be a bit more useful because the angle's a bit stronger. Then it's going to be hard to run a triple support or a quad support comp in some cases if you don't already know what you're doing. Generally speaking, when you are running a quad support comp or something like that, it's going to be based around being very aggressive, making it so that you're in a very dangerous area, trying to coax out the enemy team to use resources on you, thinking that they're just going to be able to burst through you because of your positioning or whatever it may be. And then at that point, you spam your denial, and then you take the cheesy 2v1 or 3v1 or whatever it may be to try and get a kill as fast as possible. And then you have your tanks absolutely mash W with the mass sustain, and then you have your supports go and try and deny those angles and try and fight people out of them as best they can. Now, another reason you might not want to run a comp like this is you're losing out on something like flanking, and you're losing out on burst damage, generally speaking. Obviously, you've got Zen and Kiriko to output it, but there's nothing on the support roster that's able to so consistently put out poke damage or burst damage like an Ashe, like a Sojourn, like a Widow, you know, things like that. No one's able to flank like a Tracer or a Genji or a Sombra or something like that either. And now, obviously, that might be a core part of your gameplay or style. Maybe you like the flanking, maybe you like playing the burst damage at scan or whatever it may be, and maybe you're missing out on that when you are running a triple support comp or whatever it may be. And obviously there are pros and cons to everything. This is not just like a be all and end all kind of composition where you just pick it and win the game. Obviously there are drawbacks, and it is what it is, but me personally, I think it's such an unbelievably strong comp, mainly for the reason that you have so much room for error. It is such a forgiving comp. You can make so many mistakes on this, and as long as your supports are paying attention, you have so many chances to just kind of bring it back, claw it back, whatever it may be. Like, there are so many instances where you can take a bad 1v1 or get in a situation where you should die, and you end up getting Suzu'd or life gripped or emo'd or just mass healed or whatever it may be. There are so many instances where that can happen that it makes playing the comp actually really, really simple, because there's so many chances to just try again, essentially, with all the cooldowns and denial and sustain there is on that team. Plus, you're not losing out on a lot of dueling potential. The only real dueling potential you're losing out on is how much they can be in. A support can't be in and dueling as long as a DPS can, and a support isn't able to actually generate the same amount of value on an angle as a DPS can, especially if they have a support pocket. Like, for example, a Kiriko getting pocketed by a Mercy is obviously not going to be outputting the same amount of value or be as efficient as a pocket target as something like a Soldier, Sojourn, McCree, Genji, whatever it may be. These DPS that are actually relatively good with a pocket. So you're missing out on that as well. But it is what it is. Obviously, there's pros and cons to this. I think, in my opinion, Triple Support is a relatively boring comp. It incentivizes very reactive gameplay where you're just kind of walking around, playing off denial, playing off being forgiven for making mistakes, being bailed out of situations you really shouldn't be. And I think all of those things are not very interesting dynamics in the game. Now, obviously, there are ways to fix things like Triple Support comp being as overpowered as they are. And it's just things like removing the amount of sustainability they're able to maintain, especially on themselves, but obviously other people as well. General healing output is too much. Like, Juno's healing output is absolutely fucking ridiculous. Way too high for how much utility she provides. And a lot of the heroes in that space shouldn't have the ability to have dueling potential and sustainability potential. Similarly to old Zenyatta, if you want the ability to output that damage, you need to be more of a glass cannon, in my opinion. So it's just more fair. It doesn't really make sense to me that you can have a hero that's able to output similar damage output to something like a Zenyatta, but then it also has the survivability of a Moira, being something like a Baptiste or a Kiriko or so on, where the heroes in general just don't really feel good. They kind of just feel like a be-all and end-all. Why would you pick some of the other heroes when you can just pick those supports that are capable of doing both? You know what I'm saying? And I think that's what really makes a triple support comp as bad as it is you're able to stack so many supports that are able to do everything. If it were something like older variations of comps with more supports in them, then it would be something like you have a support that's dedicated to the damage output, you have a support that's dedicated to the healing output, you have a support dedicated to the peeling output, and so on, which I think is obviously more fair than just 4 supports that can all heal, sustain, deny, damage, poke, duel for angles, and so on. And I think that's unfair. But it is what it is. Obviously, you can make your own opinion. That's why I think triple support comp is really broken, and why I think you should run it. And all the people that are saying it's actually bad right now are actually missing out on something that's really broken and a way to get essentially free wins in the mode. But it is what it is. Have a good day. I love you all. You're all very handsome, all very pretty. Have a good day. Goodbye. Good freaking bye, dude. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.